In 1193 CE, a military commander named Bakhtiyar Khilji arrived at a complex of buildings in what is now Bihar and ordered it burned. His soldiers set fire to the library. The fire burned for 3 months. 3 months. Not 3 days. Not 3 weeks. 3 months. Because there were so many books inside, so many shelves, so many manuscript collections accumulated over 700 years of unbroken scholarship that even fire could not consume them quickly. What was burning was not just paper and palm leaf. What was burning was the accumulated knowledge of one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world had ever produced. Medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, philosophy, logic, grammar, literature, theology. Every discipline that a civilization can develop, written down, copied, organized, and stored in a library that contemporary accounts described as containing 9 million manuscripts. The institution was Nalanda, and Nalanda was not alone. Across the Indian subcontinent, for more than 1,000 years before that fire was lit, India had built and maintained a network of universities, great residential campuses of learning that drew students from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Persia, Turkey, and the Arab world. Students who traveled for months, sometimes years, to reach India, sit at the feet of Indian teachers, and carry knowledge home in their heads and in their bags. Oxford University was founded in approximately 1096 CE. Cambridge received its charter in 1231. When these European institutions were just beginning, India's university network had already been running for over 1,500 years. Here is that story, university by university. Takshashila, the first university on earth. Takshashila. Taxila in the Greek accounts was not simply the oldest university in India. It is recognized as one of the oldest universities in the world, with origins reaching back to at least the 6th century BCE and quite possibly earlier. It was not a single institution in the modern sense. It was an entire city of knowledge. Takshashila operated not as one campus with a single administration, but as a loose collection of teachers of extraordinary reputation, each running their own schools, each attracting students based on nothing but the quality of their teaching. A young person who wished to study there would travel to the city, find a teacher whose reputation matched their interest, and become part of that teacher's household. Living with the guru, serving the household, and learning in the ancient Indian system called Gurukula. The subjects available at Takshashila were recorded at 68 different disciplines. These covered the 4 Vedas, archery and military science, hunting and elephant lore, astronomy and mathematics, medicine and surgery, commerce and trade, grammar and rhetoric, philosophy and law, music and the arts. A student could specialize or study broadly. Many stayed for years. The education was genuinely comprehensive in a way that had no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. The names of those who studied at Takshashila are a roll call of the minds that shaped India. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, studied and later taught here. He is credited with writing the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft, economics, and political strategy that remains one of the most sophisticated works of political science from the ancient world. His student, Chandragupta Maurya, was also educated at Takshashila before Chanakya guided him to overthrow the Nanda dynasty and found the Mauryan Empire. Panini, the grammarian who produced the most complete and rigorous analysis of any ancient language ever written, his grammar of Sanskrit remaining a reference work to this day, is believed to have been educated in the Takshashila tradition. Jivaka, the court physician to the Buddha and the most celebrated doctor of the ancient Buddhist world, studied medicine here. When Persian kings wanted the best scholars, they looked toward Takshashila. When Greek envoys arrived in India after Alexander's campaign, they found in the northwest a tradition of learning that astonished them. The Greek accounts mention Indian philosophers, whom they called gymnosophis, wise men, who engaged with the Greeks in sophisticated debates about nature, ethics, and the divine. These men were products of the intellectual culture that Takshashila had cultivated. Takshashila had no fixed tuition. A student who had the ability and the dedication was accepted by a teacher, regardless of their ability to pay. Many students worked in the teacher's household in exchange for education. The idea that knowledge should be available to those with the capacity to receive it, regardless of wealth, was foundational to the Indian educational tradition that Takshashila embodied. Takshashila declined over centuries, damaged by the White Hun invasions in the 5th century CE, and eventually losing its position as the preeminent center of learning as the great universities of the Gupta and Pala periods rose in the East. But its legacy shaped everything that came after it. The tradition of residential learning, of students traveling to find teachers, of knowledge given freely to those who deserved it. All of these were inherited and expanded by Nalanda and the universities that followed. Nalanda, the university that taught the world. Nalanda was the most famous university of the ancient world, and it deserves that description without qualification. It was founded in the early 5th century CE during the Gupta period and remained in continuous operation for approximately 700 years, longer than the entire history of most European universities. 12 successive Indian kings contributed to its construction and expansion, each one adding buildings, donating land, and endowing the institution with revenues from surrounding villages that were set aside permanently for its upkeep. At its peak, Nalanda housed approximately 10,000 students and 2,000 faculty members at any one time. The institution was genuinely international. Students came from China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Persia, and Turkey. They came because Nalanda had the best teachers in the world, because the library was unmatched, and because a diploma from Nalanda was recognized across the known world as a mark of genuine scholarship. Admission was not automatic. A gatekeeper, a scholar of extraordinary reputation, was stationed at the gate to test every prospective student. The questions he asked were not easy. Contemporary accounts suggest that only about 20% of those who attempted entry were accepted. The rest turned away, some after traveling for months to reach the gate. This was not cruelty, it was a standard. The understanding that Nalanda's reputation depended on the quality of every student it accepted, and that quality demanded rigorous selection. Once admitted, students paid nothing. Education was free, accommodation was free, food was free. The institution was funded by the revenues of over 200 villages donated by successive kings, plus ongoing donations from wealthy patrons across Asia. Even a poor student with no connections and no resources could, if accepted, spend years at Nalanda at no cost. The only currency that mattered at Nalanda's gate was intellectual ability. The curriculum was vast. Buddhist philosophy and theology formed the core, because Nalanda was primarily a Buddhist institution under Buddhist royal patronage. But the library and the faculty covered logic, grammar, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, literature, fine arts, and what would today be called comparative religion. Students studied not just their own tradition, but the traditions of others. Vedic thought, Samkhya philosophy, Nyaya logic. The ideal was breadth combined with depth. A graduate of Nalanda was expected to be genuinely learned across multiple fields, not merely expert in one narrow discipline. The library was called Dharmaganj, the treasury of Dharma. It occupied 3 separate buildings. The largest was called Ratnagiri, the ocean of gems, and it stood 9 stories tall. This was not a collection of books in any way the modern reader might imagine. It was a repository of centuries of accumulated scholarship, the original works of Indian masters, the translations of foreign texts, the commentaries and sub-commentaries and counter-commentaries that represent the living tradition of a civilization thinking hard about the most difficult questions. The Chinese scholar Xuanzang visited Nalanda in 634 CE and stayed for several years, studying under the great teacher Shilabhadra. He wrote about Nalanda in such detail that his accounts became the primary historical source for understanding the institution. He described the towers and the temples, the sound of the bells for meditation, the rhythms of daily scholarly life, the debates that would take place between scholars of different schools. He carried back to China hundreds of manuscripts, which he spent the rest of his life translating. The famous Chinese novel, Journey to the West, one of the most beloved stories in Chinese literature, is based on Xuanzang's pilgrimage to India. Nalanda's destruction came in the years around 1193 CE at the hands of Bakhtiyar Khilji. The accounts of what happened vary, but the outcome is not in doubt. The campus was burned, the monks were killed or scattered, and the library went up in a fire that lasted 3 months. When Tibetan scholars later tried to reconstruct the texts that had been at Nalanda from memory and from the copies that had been taken to Tibet, they found that much was simply gone, irretrievably lost in those 3 months of fire. Vikramashila, the place that stood when Nalanda fell. Vikramashila was founded by Dharmapala, the second king of the Pala dynasty, in the late 8th century CE. The Pala kings were among the greatest patrons of education in Indian history. Dharmapala alone is said to have founded 50 major learning centers across his kingdom. But Vikramashila was his greatest achievement. At its peak, Vikramashila had over 100 teachers and more than 1,000 students. The institution was organized differently from Nalanda, where Nalanda was a sprawling campus that had grown through centuries of incremental donation. Vikramashila was designed from the ground up as a unified academic institution. It had a central temple surrounded by 108 smaller temples arranged in a precise pattern. 6 colleges occupied the 6 sides of the main complex, each with its own academic focus. The whole was surrounded by a high wall with a single great gate, at which scholars of exceptional reputation stationed themselves to test the knowledge of every applicant. Vikramashila specialized in Vajrayana Buddhism, the tantric tradition that had become deeply significant in the later Pala period. But it was not limited to this specialization. Its faculty covered the full range of Buddhist philosophy, as well as grammar, logic, and the arts. It was particularly known for producing scholars who then carried Indian Buddhist learning to Tibet, where Tibetan Buddhism as it exists today was shaped substantially by the teachers who came from Vikramashila. The most famous graduate of Vikramashila was Atisha Dipankara, who lived in the 11th century and went to Tibet at the age of 59 to reform and revitalize Tibetan Buddhism. Atisha's work in Tibet is considered the foundation of several of the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism that continue to exist today. Another renowned figure was Naropa, one of the 84 Mahasiddhas of the Tantric tradition, who served as the head of Vikramashila's academic council. Naropa's students brought his teachings to Tibet, where they became the basis of the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. When Nalanda was attacked and burned, many of its surviving scholars fled to Vikramashila, which continued to function for some years more. But Vikramashila could not ultimately escape the same fate. Bakhtiyar Khilji's campaign continued eastward, and Vikramashila was burned shortly after Nalanda, around 1203 CE. The physical site of Vikramashila, identified with a mound at Antichak village in Bhagalpur district, Bihar, was excavated in the 20th century. The remains of the central temple, the surrounding cell structure, and the outer wall are visible. The scale of what was built there remains impressive even in ruin. Valabhi, the Forgotten University. Valabhi is the least celebrated of the great ancient Indian universities, which is an injustice that reflects more about how history is written and remembered than about Valabhi's actual importance. Located in Saurashtra, the peninsula that forms the western bulk of modern Gujarat, Valabhi was the capital of the Maitraka dynasty and a center of Hinayana Buddhist scholarship. It flourished from approximately the 6th century CE until the 12th century, making its active life comparable in length to Nalanda's. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim I Ching, who visited India in the 7th century and wrote detailed accounts of what he found, described Valabhi as a rival to Nalanda in the quality of its scholarship and the depth of its teaching. What made Valabhi distinctive was its curriculum. Where Nalanda's primary focus was on Buddhist philosophy and theology, Valabhi maintained a stronger emphasis on secular subjects: administration, law, commerce, and the practical arts of governance. Valabhi graduates went into royal service, into trade, into administration. The Maitraka kings understood that a university that produced not only monks and philosophers, but also lawyers and administrators served the kingdom in concrete and practical ways. The geographical position of Valabhi also gave it an international character that was different from the Eastern universities. Gujarat's coast faced the Arabian Sea, and Arab and Persian traders were regular visitors to the ports of the Maitraka kingdom. Valabhi sat at the meeting point of Indian Buddhist learning and the commercial networks of the Western Indian Ocean. Scholars from Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and the Arab world passed through Gujarat, and Valabhi's reputation drew the academically inclined among them. The decline of Valabhi came from the west rather than the northeast. Arab raids on the Gujarat coast from the 8th century onward disrupted the Matraka kingdom, and the destruction of Valabhi is traditionally associated with these western invasions. The exact date and circumstances are not fully established, but by the time later travelers looked for the university, it had ceased to function. Its physical remains were not excavated with the same systematic attention given to Nalanda and Vikramashila, and much of what it produced was lost. But its place in the history of Indian education, as the Western counterpart to the Eastern network of learning, as the institution that proved the Indian university tradition was not confined to a single region or tradition, deserves recognition. Odantapura. The one they thought was a fort, Odantapura, also written as Odantapuri or Udantapura, holds a particular place in the history of Indian education because of the circumstances of its destruction, which are documented in enough detail to serve as a kind of parable about what was lost across the broader university network. Founded by the Pala kings in the 8th century in Magadha, the region of modern Bihar, Odantapura is considered the second oldest of the great Mahaviharas, the monastic universities, after Nalanda. According to ancient Tibetan records, it had approximately 12,000 students at its height. The Tibetan texts that preserve the history of this period name Odantapura as one of the 5 great universities of the Pala era, alongside Vikramashila, Nalanda, Somapura, and Jagadala. Odantapura produced scholars of real distinction. Acharya Sri Ganga, who later became one of the most respected professors at Vikramashila, was trained at Odantapura. The university maintained close connections with the other Pala institutions. Scholars moved between them, texts were shared, and the whole network functioned with a degree of coordination that the sources describe as systematic rather than accidental. The circumstances of Odantapura's destruction illustrate what these institutions look like and why they were vulnerable. Bakhtiyar Khilji's forces encountered Odantapura and were apparently uncertain what they were seeing. The campus was large, walled, and housed hundreds or thousands of residents in a disciplined communal arrangement. The soldiers did not understand that the shaved-headed inhabitants were monks and scholars. They concluded that the institution must be a fort, and because the Buddhist monks had no weapons and no means of resistance, what the attackers found was not soldiers but scholars, sitting helplessly before an army that had come in search of treasure and found instead books and meditation halls. The monks who survived scattered. Some fled to Nepal, Tibet, and Southeast Asia, carrying whatever manuscripts and teachings they could transport. Others sought refuge in the remaining Pala institutions further east. The scholar community that had been built over centuries was dispersed in a matter of days. The physical institution was gone. What the scholars carried in their minds and in their bags was all that survived. Somapura, the largest campus in the ancient world. Somapura Mahavihara, the great monastery of the Good Village, was built in the late 8th century by Dharmapala of the Pala dynasty at a site that is now known as Paharpur. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its physical scale, at 27 acres of total area with a main complex of 21 acres, makes it the largest monastic complex in South Asia. The design of Somapura was unlike anything that had come before it. At the center of the campus stood a cruciform temple, a temple built in the shape of a cross with projecting wings extending in 4 directions. This central structure was massive enough to be visible from a great distance across the flat Bengal plain. Around it, in a square arrangement, ran a series of monks' cells, 177 cells arranged around an open courtyard, each providing accommodation for individual resident scholars. The outer wall enclosed the entire complex, providing both security and a clear boundary for the institution. Somapura was notable for a feature that set it apart from the more exclusively Buddhist institutions to the east. It welcomed not only Buddhist scholars, but also practitioners of Jainism and Hinduism. This inclusive approach reflected the political sophistication of the Pala kings, who maintained Buddhism as their personal faith while governing a kingdom whose population practiced multiple religious traditions. A university that welcomed scholars from different traditions was also a university that could attract scholars from a wider geographic area and generate more varied and challenging intellectual exchanges. The architectural influence of Somapura extended far beyond India. The cruciform temple design that defines Paharpur was copied and adapted in Buddhist monuments across Southeast Asia. In Myanmar, in Java, in Cambodia, the architectural fingerprint of Somapura's central temple can be traced in the design of Buddhist monuments built centuries later. The scholars who went from India to Southeast Asia, carrying Buddhism, Sanskrit, the arts, and the intellectual traditions of the Pala universities, took with them images and memories of Somapura that shaped how Buddhist sacred space was imagined and built across a vast region. Somapura functioned for approximately 400 years, from its founding in the late 8th century to the Muslim invasions of the 12th century. Its physical remains are better preserved than many of the other Pala universities because its site was excavated systematically and is now protected as a World Heritage Monument. Walking through Paharpur today, one can see the cells where the monks lived, the courtyard they walked in, the base of the great central temple. What is harder to see but equally real is the intellectual life that these stones once housed. Pushpagiri, the forgotten University of Odisha. Pushpagiri is in many ways the most remarkable of the ancient Indian universities, not because it was the largest or most famous, but because it was lost for so long and recovered so recently. The university was known to exist from the writings of the Chinese traveler Xuanzang, who visited India in the 7th century CE and described a great monastic learning center in the region called Odra, what is now Odisha. Xuanzang called it Pushpagiri and described it as occupying a mountain with a great stupa at its summit that exhibited miraculous qualities. Offerings placed between the dome and the crown reportedly floated there, unsupported, as if held by magnetism. For many centuries after Xuanzang's account, scholars debated where exactly Pushpagiri was located. Some placed it at the famous diamond triangle of Buddhist sites in Jaipur district, the three hills of Lalitgiri, Ratnagiri, and Udayagiri, each of which hosts extensive ruins of monasteries, temples, stupas, and sculptures. The identification seemed plausible. The three hills together form a university complex of remarkable scale, spread across several campuses connected by the valleys between the hills. But the actual site of Pushpagiri, as identified through excavation, turned out to be elsewhere. On Langudi Hill, approximately 18 kilometers from the Lalitgiri-Ratnagiri-Udayagiri triangle. The excavations of 1996 to 2006 carried out over 143 acres, uncovered 34 rock-cut stupas, sculptures of Buddhist figures, inscriptions clearly identifying the monastery as Pushpagiri, and architectural remains confirming continuous occupation from approximately the 3rd century CE to the 11th century CE, a span of over 800 years. Pushpagiri was founded at a time when the stupa attributed to Emperor Ashoka was already on the site, making it one of the most ancient Buddhist sacred places in India. The institution flourished under the patronage of successive rulers of Kalinga, the ancient kingdom that corresponded to modern Odisha. Its curriculum included Buddhist philosophy, logic, medicine, and astronomy. It attracted scholars from across the Indian subcontinent and, like the other great universities of this period, also welcomed visitors from China, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. Pushpagiri offers a lesson about how much of India's intellectual heritage remains undiscovered or underappreciated. This was a major institution, mentioned by the most important foreign observer of ancient Indian education, active for 8 centuries, built at a scale that required the carving of 34 rock-cut stupas, and it was not properly identified until 1996. How many other sites remain unexcavated? How many other institutions are buried under the Indian soil, waiting for someone to look? Ratnagiri, the diamond of Odisha's ancient learning. Ratnagiri, the Hill of Jewels, is the most visually impressive of the 3 sites in the Diamond Triangle of Odishan Buddhist learning. Its name is fitting. What the Archaeological Survey of India found here, when excavations proceeded seriously in the late 20th century, was a jewel of ancient Indian art and architecture that had been lying in the soil of Odisha, largely unknown to the wider world. Ratnagiri sits in Jajpur district, approximately 100 kilometers north of Bhubaneswar, on a hilltop overlooking the Brahmani river system. The site comprises four major monasteries, the largest of which is Monastery Number 1, a structure of remarkable quality whose brick construction and stone detailing represent some of the finest Buddhist monastic architecture in India. The sculptures found at Ratnagiri are considered among the best examples of Buddhist art from the post-Gupta period, figures of the Buddha, bodhisattvas, and tantric deities rendered with a sophistication and refinement that places them in the same category as the most celebrated ancient Indian sculptures anywhere. As part of the Pushpagiri complex, or its immediate neighbor in the Diamond Triangle, Ratnagiri shared in the intellectual and religious life of one of India's great centers of Buddhist learning. The monastery complex would have housed monks and scholars engaged in the same disciplines as the other great universities: Buddhist philosophy and theology, logic, medicine, grammar, and the arts. The quality of the sculptures and architecture suggests that this was a well-resourced, well-patronized institution, drawing on the traditions of the finest craftsmen and the most generous kings of Kalinga. Ratnagiri's decline, like that of the other Pala-era institutions, came through a combination of invasion from the north and the gradual decline of Buddhist patronage, as Hinduism re-emerged as the dominant religious tradition of the region. But Ratnagiri's influence did not simply disappear. The sculptural and architectural traditions developed at Ratnagiri and its sister sites in Odisha flowed directly into the great temple-building traditions of the region. The temples of Konark and the Jagannath Temple at Puri carry within their artistic DNA the inheritance of what the Buddhist monastery builders and sculptors of Ratnagiri achieved. Ratnagiri today is a protected archaeological site. The museums adjacent to the site display sculptures recovered from the excavations, among the finest collections of Buddhist art anywhere in India. Efforts are ongoing to achieve UNESCO World Heritage recognition for the Ratnagiri-Udayagiri-Lalitgiri Triangle, which would bring global attention to an artistic and intellectual heritage that deserves to be as well known as Nalanda. Jagadala, the last light. Jagadala Mahavihara was founded by King Ramapala of the Pala dynasty, who ruled from approximately 1077 to 1120 CE. It was built in the Virendra region of Bengal, near the site of Somapura. It was the last great university built under the Pala dynasty, and it became, in the final years of the Indian university network, the most important surviving center of Buddhist learning on the subcontinent. The significance of Jagadala rests partly in what it was and partly in what it witnessed. When Nalanda was burned, scholars fled to Vikramashila. When Vikramashila was burned, they fled further east and south, some arriving at Jagadala. The Tibetan Buddhist teacher Sakya Sribhadra, one of the most important scholars of his generation, traveled to Jagadala after seeing Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapura destroyed. He stayed at Jagadala for 7 years. During those years, his student Dhanasila translated 10 major Sanskrit texts into Tibetan from manuscripts held at Jagadala. Those translations survived. The originals did not. Jagadala was especially important as a center for Vajrayana Buddhist scholarship and for the translation work that was connecting Indian Buddhist learning to Tibet. The Tibetan accounts of this period preserve a remarkable picture. As one institution after another was destroyed in India, Tibetan scholars were rushing to collect, copy, and translate as many texts as they could, before the institutions that held them were gone. The relationship between India and Tibet in this period was essentially a rescue operation. Tibet saving what India was losing. Jagadala was destroyed around 1207 CE, among the last of the great Pala institutions to fall. By this point, the entire network of universities that had defined Indian intellectual life for over 1,000 years had been eliminated within the span of roughly 15 years. The scholars who survived did so primarily by fleeing to Nepal and Tibet, carrying the tradition in their minds and in whatever manuscripts they could transport. Tibetan Buddhism as it exists today is substantially the living continuation of what was taught at Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapura, and Jagadala. The teachings that the Tibetan scholars preserved, at enormous personal cost and across enormous distances, kept alive a tradition that had been physically destroyed in the land where it originated. India lost its libraries. Tibet kept the knowledge. Between 1193 and 1207 CE, the entire network of great Indian universities was destroyed in approximately 15 years. Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapura, Valabhi had already fallen to Western raiders. Jagadala was the last. The most extraordinary educational system the ancient world had produced was dismantled within a generation. What was lost cannot be fully calculated. What survived did so because of the determination of individuals under extreme pressure. India got back a shadow of what it lost. The physical sites were rediscovered by archaeologists. Nalanda has been rebuilt in a modern form, but the living tradition of scholarship that was housed in these institutions, the teachers and students, the debates and the commentaries, the accumulated wisdom of 7 centuries of unbroken intellectual work, that is gone. The greatest tragedy in this history is not the destruction itself. Great civilizations have had their knowledge destroyed before and after India. The greatest tragedy is that so many people have never been told what was there to begin with. Colonial history, which shaped the curriculum in India for 2 centuries, had no interest in presenting India as a civilization that had invented higher education, that had welcomed the world's students, that had maintained free residential universities of extraordinary quality for over 1,000 years before Oxford was founded. People who do not know what they once built cannot feel the full weight of what was taken from them, and cannot feel the full confidence of what they are capable of building again. Every one of these sites is a standing monument to an idea that India originated. The idea that knowledge should be freely available to those who have the capacity to receive it. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to see what India was, so they can understand what India is becoming. Like, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.